And if anything, I think that this year, the events of 2020 in general have shaken us to the core. You feel shaken up a little bit? A lot going on. You know, from everything from worldwide pandemic, we've got unprecedented job loss and unemployment, racial injustice, contentious politics, businesses are shutting down, closing their doors. All of these events have shook us to our core. And more than just us as individuals, but it's our community, our nation, and really our world. And when you look around, who has that sense of surety, that sense of restoration, that sure-footed, just certainty on the journey that we're in good hands? And as hard as it can be to get to that place where we feel that way, I think it is possible. I think God has good plans for us, but it can be really hard to see. Again, do you feel shaken to your core? Have you felt a little shook up lately? Things are a little uneasy? You know, many of us, I think, feel trapped in the moment. And to get outside of that moment, I think, is the key for us to see what God's really up to. So as I talk to people and I kind of try and gauge, like, how are people feeling right now? There's a lot of this kind of like sense of maybe being trapped. Maybe you feel a little bit stuck, trapped in your house, stuck where you are, standing still. Are we just held hostage to all of these crazy things that are going on in the world? I don't know about you, I'm kind of worried about the future. It's pretty uncertain, I think, from everything from economics to policy in our country to what's this disease going to do? Is it going to go back up? Are we getting better? Who really knows? Am I even getting the right information? Does anybody really know what's going on? And all of that can kind of make you feel like we're just standing right here at this precipice, like we're right at the edge, frozen. We're just waiting to see what's going to happen. Do you feel a little stuck like that? Do you feel frozen in the moment, like it's hard to look ahead, the future seems uncertain, I'm not too sure what's going on? Where is that sure-footed certainty that we're really looking for? I think the problem is that we get trapped in a moment, and when we're in the moment, for some reason, we kind of get blinded to the rest of what's going on. Like we're trapped a little bit. Like we take the moment out of the context of the big, big picture. When we get trapped in the moment, we're just looking at just what's right in front of us. It's the year of COVID. It's what's the fate of the election? And everywhere you turn, whether you turn on the news or anything, when you talk to people, doesn't it feel like our whole fate just hangs in the balance? Like if the wrong candidate wins, y'all, whichever one that is for you, if the wrong one wins, isn't it a disaster? Doesn't the country stop? Isn't it the worst thing that could possibly happen? Aren't we just right on the edge of some kind of disaster? We haven't had enough disasters, so we have to just keep waiting and kind of manufacturing more. But aren't we just right on the edge? Do you feel like you're just standing frozen right on the edge, waiting for something to happen? And we're just hoping that we're going to be okay. But the problem is when we get trapped in a moment, it's a very small window. It's like our lens just kind of restricts, and all we can see is right in the moment. And the problem is that's a little view of what's happening in our world. It's a little small box we kind of are stuck looking through. It offers very little hope, and the lens just restricts down, and it can be really hard to see a way out. But what if this moment that we're in right now is more than just misfortune? Okay? It can be really hard to see, but what if for a minute, if you can imagine, what if this moment is more than just impending doom coming? What if it's more than just the end of everything? The apocalypse is here. If you hear that? Emergency. Things are happening all the time. There's fires going on, right? I mean, all of the end times things of the apocalypse are happening, right? And what's next? Like pestilence? What even is that? I don't know, but it sounds bad, and it's only ever used in negative context. It seems like, isn't it the end of everything? And aren't all these talking heads trying to tell us, like, danger, warning? And I feel like I've gotten to a place where even just going outside of my house, you know, I'm so worried about coming into contact with other people. Aren't we sending a negative message to everyone like people are dangerous? And isn't that like the worst thing that we could be doing in our culture? You know, our nation right now, if you look at how contentious our politics and everything else is, this is all a symptom of the fact that we're not healthy as a society. We can't disagree with one another, and we can't actually see things from other people's perspective without it descending into blows, nasty insults, and other things. This whole contention there it's really hard, and if we get trapped in that moment, all we see is impending doom, the end of everything, the collapse of everything that is good and decent in our world. It's negative. It's kind of grate on you a little bit. It's exhausting. And there's so many people I talk to, and they just seem so tired. You feel a little tired lately? Just more emergencies. They're happening. Huh? Exactly. Just when you thought it was gone, it comes back around. But what I want to talk about today is what happens if we actually widen that lens out a little bit. Instead of being trapped in the moment with no context of what God's really doing, how do we see God in this moment? I think that if we pull back and widen the lens a little bit, and we put this moment in a bigger context of what God is really up to, I think we can see really something that's going to be amazing. We need to get perspective. We need to get context. How do we interpret the times that we're in, make sense out of it? How can we see what God's actually doing in the moment where we're at? Because I believe if we can move beyond just this tiny little myopic, tiny little lens that we're looking through, if we can pull out, widen the context a little and see what God's really up to, I think we can move past a lot of things. Like instead of being trapped in a place of fear, can we move to a place of faith? Instead of being in a place of anxiety and worry, can we get to a place of confidence and assurance? And I think what God wants is, I think he wants us to have that perspective. I think God wants to give us a window into that, so we're not just trapped, frozen, standing, getting ready to fall off the cliff, because everything good and decent in our world is about to descend into chaos. And I believe that God has actually been preparing your story for a time just like this. One of the most amazing things in my life that's happened is last week I got called to be associate pastor here, which is incredible honor, very humbling, and part of my personal journey and something that God's been doing in my life for years. You know, 2 months ago I got to celebrate the birth of our child Isabel, and that's something that has been a dream inside our hearts for a long time as well. There's things happening in my own personal life that are like, you know, have taken a long time. We're talking like a decade, you know? I was doing the math. Like, I've been in school over a decade to get to this point. Chloe and I have been married for 11 years. We've been praying for a child for over 10 years. That's a long time to realize something. But this is really not about me. Today is about you. And I want you to know that God has a story and things that are in the works right now in the midst of the chaos. And if you just get trapped in the moment with all of the nonsense and chaos that's being spewed at you, I don't want you to lose sight of what God's doing in your life right now. And so I want to tell you that this, I think, is your time to become all that God desires for you. I think, in fact, that this is the season to lean into his invitation. It's to grow in the midst of the difficulties that are there, because this is when love will and must inspire you. This is when God's grace should define you, and we should seek to be transformed. Because what if in the midst of all this chaos, in the midst of this moment, what if God is actually up to something right now, and he actually wants to transform us into his likeness for the benefit of the world? And if we read in the Bible, we're going to look at two passages today that Paul wrote to the churches. So this is a message from Paul to the church. And what he's saying is that through us being transformed, we can actually have an effect on the world. Let me back up a little bit. So if the world is in chaos, and we look at these big, big problems, pandemic, that's a big problem. How are we going to go solve these big problems in the world? I think we have to start, I think it starts with us. And that's what really these passages are aimed at. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 18, it says, all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord, as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. This verse has something to tell us about what transformation really is. Because if we're transformed, how are we going to have an effect on this world, and how do we engage, and how are we not somebody who only sees the doom, the gloom, and the impending chaos that's coming? And so Paul writes here, unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord. This goes back to the Old Testament. Think of Moses and the idea that, looking right at God's face, if you look directly, it's, you can't handle it. And in fact, in the Hellenistic Greek world, that was something that was there too. Like if you looked at one of the gods, then you kind of became like a god. And so Paul's tapping into this when he's talking. He says, but it's like being reflected in a mirror. And this idea of a mirror, I think, is powerful because it paints a picture. Really what he says in the surrounding text here, he says that Jesus is the mirror by which we can see God. So it's this special lens through which we get to see God, and that God can affect us. And it says right here that when we look to God, we can be transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord whose Spirit. So beyond the moment of conversion, if we talk about transformation, that's more than just this momentary conversion, because transformation happens over time. Again, it's not trapped in a moment. There is a moment of conversion, which is important. It's powerful. But then there's this bigger picture, this bigger story about what's really transformation. So beyond the moment of conversion, ongoing transformation, fundamental to life and faith. Paul's talking about a radical change. It's a new creation. It's about moving from death to life, from sin to righteousness. He's defining transformation in big, powerful, bold terms for them. Because Jesus' resurrection is the spark. It's the catalyst. It ushers in an entire new age. And that new age is now. We're living in it. And then Jesus comes again to finish it and complete it. That is a long time. That's not trapped in a moment. I think that's the bigger context we can be in. And so when we talk about how to be transformed by grace, how to be the people that Jesus has called us to be, we got to think in a bigger context. Because the fact is we're a work in progress. But I'm moving toward completion, until that end time when Jesus comes again. He says the day of Christ. There is this day when Jesus comes back and makes everything new. Right? Wait. Or, because I've heard people talk like this, it's like, we're going to go get into a rocket ship. We're going to jettison out of here. The world is in chaos. It's no good. It's going down. The sirens are blazing. Things are happening. Pandemic, right? Unrest, like all of these things that are happening. We just got to get out of here. That's a lot of people's view of what heaven is. But that's not what the Bible talks about. And that's not what Paul's saying. We're waiting for the restoration of all things when Jesus comes to make all things new. And isn't that a much better vision for what restoration is? If you want a restored life, the grace of God comes to make you new. Jesus doesn't give up on us and just check out. And as the church and as Christians, we don't have the luxury to just jettison on out of here either. So while we're here, we have a job to do, we have work to do, and that is really what comes right out of that transformation. And so Paul talks about, that we're moving toward completion, that he uses the idea of being born, and that being transformed is a process. And so this act of conversion is kind of it's a birth of sorts. So about 5 years ago, God called me to be a pastor. I was on a mountain. I'm serious. It's so cliche. I hate that. That's how it happened, and I can't avoid it. In California. Yeah, that one stings too. But it was clear as day, and I just remember trying to seek God in a quiet moment just to say, what, God, I'll do what you want. What do you really want from me? He said, pastor. One word, that's all I got. So I went to school, and, I just graduated, and so now I'm going to be a pastor. Awesome. Finish line, right? Done. Later, y'all. Nope. In fact, this is really just the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how I see the idea of conversion and things. What's interesting, again, I want to put your life and God's plan and purpose in your life into a larger context. And so hopefully sharing some of my story and being vulnerable will help you see some of that. This is not my favorite part of preaching, but it is an important part, right? Kind of sharing. So you guys can share with me later. So, I have this calling. God says, go be pastor. Okay. Reluctantly, I said yes. Okay. And I came back to church, and I think I got up here and I told everybody, God called me to be a pastor. And what was our reaction? Yeah. There was that, and then there was the, duh. Because somehow everybody here knew except for me. And there was this interesting moment in the staff meeting we were in, and I got to hear a lot of our staff talking about how they had already seen this before in me. So something I didn't know. See, God had been doing something in my life for a long time. And one example in particular really struck me because John, who always has this keen insight, I don't know how he does, but he always does, he remembered my confirmation. So I was, like 12? I had no idea. And frankly, I was kind of like a troubled teen. I got into a lot of trouble, and at that time, that would have been the last thing you would have thought would happen. And John says he knew in that moment that I was going to be a pastor. How wild is that? I think there's something amazing that happens in community when we're connected to one another, that God has this plan. See, God had that plan and had shown it to people unbeknownst to me, and I thought, I've had a revelation, y'all. I have discovered something. And I got the, yay! I got the, duh, of course. But see, God had been up to something, and God had actually shown that to the great Christians that were around me and to our church members. And isn't that a beautiful picture of what the transformed life really is and how God's engaging with your story? See, you all have a story that God's working on, and probably the people that are in this building can see that story and will tell you, duh. If you'll just ask. And isn't that the beauty of our community? The real thing about this is that the transformed life is, it really is just the beginning. When you start to walk with Jesus, right? And maybe you're somebody that you're not too sure about the whole Jesus thing yet. Maybe you are a lifelong committed Christian who knows the power of God and has really met Jesus and been shaken up. I want a message that's going to challenge you, convict you, but also comfort you. Because I think what Jesus wants for us is not some kind of escapist route, to provide an alternative where we can retreat into this amazing transformation that's happened for us. Like, what if I just took all those stories and all that great stuff that God's done in my life, and I just kind of hoarded it away for myself and didn't tell anybody about it? Just kept it to myself. I don't think that's why God does things in our life, and I think you have a story, and I think you're going to have to share it as well, and I think that's really the challenge. The challenge is we have these moments of profound importance where we see what God is doing in someone's life and we have an option to go and tell them or just not. And sometimes it's easier not to, right? But can you imagine what can happen if you go share that story? When John told me that, I got to tell you, it really kind of messed me up. I was all emotional. It's awful. We were on the Zoom call with the staff. It was terrible. I'm like, suck it up, man. But it was a powerful moment in my life that John shared with me. So really, as God's moving and transforming our life, it's not just for our benefit. That would be a selfish vision of what Christianity really is. Jesus' redeeming grace for our world, if it stops with us and it doesn't move out into our world, that's not the vision. The reason that the early church exploded is because the Christians, they were saved, there was conversion, transformation, and then over time, those people were sharing their story. You look at anywhere that Christianity is growing in our world today, it's because people are having their very real lives changed, and they are sharing that story and message with other people. And they're not getting distracted with politics or other very messy topics, right? They're able to really share their story in the heart of what God has done, because that's going to be way more impactful than me sitting and arguing over bullet points of policy. That's really not going to change anybody's heart or mind. But me sharing my story might just connect to somebody, and I think that's the vision of transformation. So your story, realizing what God's done in your life, has to go translate back into community. Because really, if we want to have an effect on our world today, how can we do that? How do we tackle the big problems? The pandemic, it's a big problem. All the problems in our society. How do we go attack those problems? It's really through us being changed and transformed, and then going and sharing that. And what happens is there's a groundswell of change that can really, it's changed the world, and it can continue to change the world. It's the reason why I think God's not just done with planet Earth yet. As dire as it may seem, God's not done, and we have work to do. And so we read in Philippians chapter 1, verses 4 through 6, and Paul says, "In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. I pray with joy." Paul wrote this from prison. So as dire as it seems now, we can still have joy if Paul can find it in prison, because what he says is there's a partnership in the gospel. And then it's from the first day of their conversion until now and ongoing into the future until Jesus comes again. We are in that timeline. We're in that story. We're not stuck in a moment. We're not frozen or held hostage to this current moment. No matter how bad it seems, there's more to the story. There's more to your life, and there's more for our world today. From the first day until now, it says, being confident of this. Don't you want confidence? I do. He began a good work in you and will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus Christ. You see, the picture of a timeline here is important. Where does Paul get his confidence from? He gets his confidence from how good God has been and what God has done. And then in that present moment, even in jail, he's thinking about how good God has been, and he knows God's going to be consistent and great in the future and has big plans and will continue to complete the good work that he started into the future. You see, Paul sees beyond just the dire moment. That's really hard for us. Things look so bad. How does the fate of everything not hang on the election? We're like 3 weeks away? Oh, we're right in the thick of it, y'all. Right? Are you watching some of this stuff? Nutty. It's stressful. It's exhausting. I don't know what's going to happen. Well, here's the okay, so when it's over, 3 weeks, let's fast forward. Let's fast forward 3 weeks. Is it all going to be better? You going to feel great after it's done? Even if your candidate wins. Woohoo. And we encourage people to vote. I think you should use your voice as part of that process, that civic duty. That's a good thing. But if your candidate wins, and it's 3 weeks from now or whatever, you can feel better? Do you feel like everything's just going to be resolved? I don't believe so, because I don't think the hope for our world is ever going to come from any political authority. Policies in our country are important. We should participate. We should be able to talk about things in a more healthy way than is right now in the public debate. But the fact is that really the transformation that goes on in each one of us is going to be the thing that changes other people's lives. I was having a conversation with somebody who's in a really tough spot, really tough spot, and got some really unhealthy relationships and stuff, and is really in a dark place. And as I was talking to them, I was just thinking, they then somehow transition to the election. It's like all that stress and anxiety just balled up into one thing. So I don't know, it just kind of crosses all the boundaries, I guess, and gets all mushed together. Maybe you felt like that. But I kind of just started thinking about, the election. Either way it goes, I don't know that my job's changed. Where the country's heading, all those things. We have to trust at some point that God's still in control and God still has good plans, even at a macro level. But me personally, what am I going to keep doing? I have to keep looking to Jesus every day to try and walk out my faith, to live the transformed life that Paul's talking about, so I can go and I can talk to other people and try and make their life better. Because that's the only way that I think our world gets better. Because the gospel, as Paul describes it, is about a transformation that affects all of life. And it goes beyond just an individual, right? Something personal, something private. It's about my story, my journey. That's important. But you have to go share it, because if we're going to talk about this amazing, transformative, world-changing thing, that the universe is fundamentally changed after the resurrection, that has to go beyond just our little bubbles and little moments. It's got to go to the whole of life. It's got to affect community and family, right? That kind of vision, that big vision for redemption and the restored life, that's something that changes the world. It's about collective change, fellowship, partnership in the gospel, desiring what's best for others, helping other people even reach their potential. That's a much bigger vision than just a little bit, and I think that's what Paul says. So he's confident and joyful even in prison, and he's confident that the prayers will be answered because he believes that God will be glorified in our lives. What he's talking about is not some kind of vague hope. He's talking bold confidence, because it's based firmly on what God has already done in the past, and it's about how consistent he believes God will be in the future. Because what God has done is a good work in you, and God doesn't give up on us. There's no ejector button that we're just going to get out of here, and God's not going to leave us or just wipe out the earth again. So despite how terrible it looks and how everybody's preaching the doom and gloom, that's not what God talks about. He talks about having good plans and bringing them to completion, and so your life has a trajectory there. And so really the question you have to reflect and say is, do we base our hopes for the future on what God has actually done in the past? Are we able to look at our lives now, and we look in that moment, as dire as it looks, are we able to really look back at what God's done in our life so that we can then go look forward? There is a future, right? There's something that happens after pandemic lockdown. When that is, who knows? No one has the answers. After the election, there's something that's next. And so what are we looking forward to, and what's our hope? It has to be based on what God's already done for us. The future can't be just like an escape, but it's really about a completion and about restoration. And really, restoration is about an invitation for you. Living a restored life is about you realizing how you've been transformed, how God has intersected your life. How God has come in your darkest moments and always been there for you. You have a story and you have a journey. We all have things where we get hung up. And for me, I have this core fear that drives me. And I believe you all do too. There's a core fear inside of you. And I think one of the biggest things that God's done for me is address that core fear. I have this core fear that I am just going to be inadequate all the time. I can't shake it. Now, maybe for you, that's not really the thing. Maybe yours is I feel like I'm just not, I'm not going to be good enough. Or I feel like people are going to just abandon me. They're just going to leave me. And you got this unshakable fear that's always there. I feel like if I'm not kind of in control of things, and I don't have a good grasp, then everything goes bad. Then it turns to chaos. We all have these things, and so mine is this unshakable fear of this inadequacy, never being good enough, never being able to measure up. And isn't that why I'm somebody who could preach the grace and gospel of Christ? Because it says it doesn't matter how good you are, how qualified you are. But in addition to that, as ill-equipped as I can feel sometimes, God is actually, the truth that comes back to counter that fear is that actually I've been well-equipped for stuff. There's an education, I've got great people around me, I have people that have talked about how God's had a calling on my life this whole time. There has been this very clear journey that I've been on. It's really been pretty impactful for me, but you still have that core unshakable fear. The life of transformation is that every day you got to go back and look at Jesus. And if you don't go back and you don't see Jesus, what are you going to do? That mirror can either be a way to look at Jesus, okay? To look forward, look to God, to see what's inside you, and become more like Christ. Or you sit there and just look at your face in the mirror all day and keep your little journey to yourself, right? And I think that bigger story is we have to rely on God. And if we think we're going to fix it, so let me give you another instance. So if you look at that mirror, and that mirror is kind of angled, right? And you're looking up at God. Or you can just be looking at yourself all the time. Let me give you another picture of what that looks like. Not looking to God, but really looking to ourselves or looking around the world. Again, myopic vision, small lens. That's what we don't want. We have to put in a bigger context and a big lens. A lot of people are just looking at all the events of the world kind of like this, right? God has a bigger vision for what our life is, and we just keep looking at the same little things. Just keep spinning and rotating in your head. You keep getting fixated. You can't shake it. When really what God's saying is, if you look to me, I'm gonna be the one that can ease your fears. I'm the one who can speak truth into your life that really is life-changing. It's that same truth that you can go and share with somebody else that really changes things. But it's not because of how great you are, and it's not because you have all the answers or anything. It's only because you can look to God and God transforms and changes your life. Why? So you can go and change other lives. And that's how I think the world actually gets better for us. Are we looking at the world or are we looking at God? Right now, anyone who can tell you what God's up to in the world, beyond simplistic answers of like, I think God's about to shut this thing down. Like beyond that. Some people are saying that, right? It's the end, y'all. Pack it up. We got to get on the spaceship. We got to get out of here. But anyone who can see what God's doing in the world right now, I think has a better grasp on where we should be focused. You have people in your life, you know what God's doing, you see the story God's painting, you need to go let them know what you see. And if you don't know where your story's at, how God's working in your life, you should hang out with a good Christian friend who can speak that truth into your life, I know you see it. In fact, all of us that are here today, we all know each other pretty well for the most part. You could probably go to just about anybody in here and say, you think God's working in my life right now? And I guarantee you they will have something to tell you that will it'll shake you to your core, and then you'll be like, I was there, John's making me all emotional in front of everybody, and then I'm mad that I'm emotional. It's a whole terrible cycle. But at the same time, it's just really good to know and to feel how close God can be in those moments. And when you sit back and reflect on how God has been, what God's been up to in your life, and you get there and just, how surprised are you how far you've come? How much have you grown to deal with those core fears and those problems and anxieties that you have in your life? We're not perfect. We're a work in progress. But we will be complete one day when Jesus returns to make all things new. That's the way of restoration. And so I'll go back and say, what if in the midst of all of the chaos in our world and all this stuff, what if we can really focus on living a life of transformation, of focusing on what Jesus is doing in our life, how we are being made new all the time, about how God is moving and working in our world. And isn't that so much better to focus on than all of the chaos and the madness? I think that we can live a transformed life, be restored, and we can go and help other people find the same thing. And if we're looking at God, what happens is we are really looking at, it's more about faith than it is about fear. It's more about confidence than it is about anxiety, right? That we're assured and we're not just uncertain all the time. I'm not constantly confused. I have clarity because of who God is and how God's acting in my life. That fundamentally changes how I relate to the entire world. I hope that the message today is really going to serve as a call for us to reflect Christ to a world that is in desperate need. So, I said, what if all of the crazy stuff in our world, like what if the time right now, what if this moment is actually an opportunity for transformation and for us to do something? I think we need to really heed that call and give it some serious thought, because I believe right now is the time we need to be more vocal. We don't need to shut down about our faith because we're afraid that somebody's not going to like it or whatever. Like, me sharing my story has power. And I've never shared my story and had somebody get mad. I haven't. Every time I do it, when I get past all the stuff in my head that's like, don't do it, it's going to be weird, they're going to feel awkward, it's going to be terrible, get past all that stuff. When you share how Christ has actually transformed your life, people connect to that. And I think that's how we go change the world. This moment right now, we should not be seeing this as everything's going down, we just got to get out of here. I think that's the wrong message for us in our world today. And whichever candidate wins in 3 weeks, the whole political power game that's going on, will keep going, right? Because whoever wins is going to say, well, the other guy, well, I should have won, and the other guy shouldn't have won, and, on and on and on and on in our world. But when the early Christians went and said, Jesus is Lord, not some Caesar, not some person in a political office, not Lord, God's still in control and still has plans for our world. And Jesus' approach is not to go make a power grab, if you'll notice. If you look at the life of Jesus, he got brought to trial. He lived a life of sacrifice. And what did he do? He shared his life openly with close friends. And I think that's more the life that we should be going after. Let all the crazy stuff, God's got plans for that stuff. But we have control over how we're going to live our lives and where we focus. So are you going to sit there and just keep focusing on the problems about to fall off the cliff, frozen? Or are you going to focus on God and what God's doing for you and look through that lens? Because when you look for God and you try and see what God's doing every day, God changes your life, and that has the power to go and change the world around you. So if you want to know how we fix the world today and how we're going to tackle all these big, big problems, there's no process, no system, no power, no government is going to do it. The fact is the only way to do it is for us to continue to look to God and to share our story and to live a life that's truly transformed. So I'll say it again. I believe that this is your time to become all that God desires for you. I think this is your season to lean into the invitation. God is calling you today. You're here for a purpose and a reason. You made it here to listen to this message because God wants you to hear something in this. I think what you're supposed to hear is there's an invitation for you to live your life a little differently when you walk out of here. I would hate for you to say that was such a great message, I feel so nice, and not take this into the rest of your week and say, you know what? There's a real invitation for real change. You know, we're about to celebrate communion. And that right there, that is some serious transformation right there. Jesus told us to do that and do it often. Why? Because we're woefully forgetful creatures. The reason why we come up here, and I mean, we sing a lot of the same songs almost every week. Have y'all noticed that? There's a lot of the same words in a lot of those songs. Have you noticed that too? It's because we need a good reminder. It's really good for us to be reminded. And what I think God has for you today is an invitation for you to live a changed life, to go and to be a light in the world, for you to just be a bit of a mirror and reflect the light of God to people. You can be the mirror. Reflect God into the world and show people where God's moving in their life. Look for that. Stop looking for reasons to argue and fight with people. Look for what God's doing and go share what God's doing in your life. Because I believe the call is to grow through your difficulties, and this is a difficult time, no doubt. This is when the love of God must inspire you. And this is when His grace must define you. And the call is to be transformed and to realize that goes on every day and that it makes a difference in our world. And so again, I'll go back to our question of what if Jesus is transforming us into His likeness for the world to see? That's really the invitation for us. When we come and celebrate communion, there's a connection point that happens. So, prepare your heart. Be open to what God has for you. My prayer is that you'll see a little bit of that story and what God's up to. And I know from my own experience, God's faithful and we'll connect when we're open.
Yes.
So
you can do this because you can have confidence that from the very beginning, Christ has been working inside of you to this very day. And you can do this because there are days ahead where what He has done in the past is going to prepare and propel you forward in this time. So I pray that God blesses you and that you leave here with that confidence. You can do it.